Hi folks, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that over the last 24 to 48 hours, a lot of influencers have decided to jump into, and needless to say, a lot of them are unfortunately ill-equipped to actually have this sort of conversation. This is not just a viral moment or a reaction clip. This is a conversation that involves public policy. It involves legal standards. It involves how law enforcement applies force under pressure. It involves federal jurisdiction. And it involves organized activist efforts to obstruct law enforcement, as well as media literacy, specifically how narratives get amplified, distorted, and emotionally escalated in ways that make it extremely difficult for the public to understand what actually happened in highly contentious situations such as the Alex Pretti shooting. Now, I want to be very clear up front that the point of this video is not to personally attack anyone. This is not a character assassination. This is not about dunking on an individual creator. The goal here is to lower the temperature of this conversation and bring it back to the facts, evidence, and legal reality, not inflammatory language, not ideological framing, and not emotionally loaded conclusions that get people more angry without making them more informed. Now, the reason I'm choosing to respond specifically to Charlie's video is not because he's uniquely malicious or dishonest. In fact, in many cases, Charlie is known for being fairly level-headed. The issue here is influence. His video on this incident has pulled in roughly 3.6 million views. That means it is shaping how millions of people understand what happened in Minnesota, how they assign blame, and how they emotionally interpret a very serious and very real death. See, when a creator with that level of reach frames an event in a way that is absolutist, inflammatory, and legally sloppy, it doesn't just reflect an opinion, it actively hardens a narrative. Now, before we go even further, I want to say this plainly. Alex Pretti should not be dead. His death is tragic. It is unacceptable that a man lost his life in this encounter, but acknowledging that does not mean we get to shut our brains off, pick a side, and pretend the facts don't matter. It also does not mean we get to reduce a complex federal law enforcement encounter into a comic book story where one side is pure evil and the other side is pure innocence. That kind of framing helps absolutely no one, and it guarantees we learn nothing from what happened here. All that said, what we're currently seeing playing out culturally is an escalation of rhetoric around Alex Pretti's death, which ignores legal standards and substitutes moral certainty for evidence. You cannot simply point to ICE or Border Patrol and label them Gestapo or treat them as cartoon villains without actually walking through the sequence of events, the legal authority involved, and the decisions that were made on the ground. Two things can be true at the same time. Alex Pretti's death can be tragic and unjust, and his actions in that moment can still have materially contributed to how the situation escalated. Now, before we even touch Charlie's video, it's important to establish what we actually know. Not what Twitter thinks happened, not what partisan actors are claiming, but what the available evidence shows so far. Based on video analysis conducted by CNN, court declarations from eyewitnesses, and reporting from multiple outlets, here is what can be reasonably stated. Alex Pretti was present at the scene of a federal immigration operation in Minneapolis. Multiple bystander videos show him filming federal agents and interacting verbally with them. Witness declarations indicate that he appeared to be helping manage traffic and yelling at officers to leave other individuals alone. Now, all that said, Alex was doing that while, according to DHS, agents were conducting a targeted operation against an illegal alien wanted for violent assault. Now, there's a disagreement between federal officials and independent observers over whether the crowd constituted a riot, but video reviewed by CNN does not show Pretti acting violently or holding a firearm in his hands, though he had it on him. Now, what the videos do show is a confrontation that escalates rapidly. Pretti inserts himself into this ICE operation. He is sprayed with a chemical irritant. He is then taken to the ground. Multiple agents pile onto him. At some point during that struggle, an agent is seen retrieving a firearm from Pretti's waistband and moving away from the pile. Seconds later, shots are fired and Pretti is killed. There are reasons and legitimate questions about the timing of the shots, the perception of the threat, and whether the use of force was justified under departmental policy. Even law enforcement experts interviewed by CNN have said there are unanswered questions and that Pretti does not appear to have had his hand on the firearm at any point. Now, all that said, at the same time, it is also factually accurate to say that Pretti inserted himself into an active federal law enforcement operation, physically interposed himself between agents and another individual, resisted arrest, detention, yes, and he was armed while doing all of that. Those facts matter They don't justify his death, but they are not irrelevant, and pretending they don't exist is intellectually dishonest. Now, there has been a lot of speculation online about what exactly happened at that moment the firearm was removed, including speculation about accidental discharges and the specific weapon models. Many are speculating that Alex was carrying a SIG, which is known for misfires, but at this point, all of that remains speculation. There's no confirmed evidence yet of a weapon malfunction, an accidental discharge, or a specific trigger event that caused officers to believe a shot had been fired. Body camera footage has not been released yet, and until it is, any definitive claims about that moment should be treated cautiously. Now, what we can say is this. This was a high-pressure, rapidly evolving encounter involving federal agents attempting to detain an individual who was resisting arrest while armed. That combination alone creates an extremely dangerous situation. This does not mean the shooting was justified. It also does not mean that rushing to label the event an execution or claiming it was solely the result of lawful gun ownership is supported by the evidence currently available. Now, all that said, the dominant narrative being pushed, particularly on the left, is that Alex Pretti was a lawful gun owner who was executed in broad daylight simply for exercising his Second Amendment rights. The video evidence does not support that framing. And unfortunately, that is a narrative that many people are running with, and we see parts of it in Charlie's video using language and certainty that go far beyond what the facts actually allow. Anyway, all that said, what I want to do now is walk through Charlie's video carefully, point by point, not to attack him personally, but to show where the rhetoric outruns the evidence, where legal standards are misapplied, and where emotional framing replaces factual analysis. If we actually care about justice, accountability, and preventing tragedies like this from happening again in the future, then we have to be willing to slow down, get the facts straight, and resist the urge to turn every death into a political weapon. Now, with all that being said, let's go to Charlie's video, and let's start from the beginning.
Filmed this video earlier this morning when the story first broke. It's the killing of Alex Pretti in Minnesota at the hands of border agents. And I made the video, but I was pretty heated and I wanted to kind of simmer down and take a break, so I went out before posting it. I just got home, and now even more angles and videos have been released that show beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is a 100% unjustified killing of an American citizen here. And it seems like the execution stems from them finding out that he had a gun on his person, his Second Amendment rights. In all of the videos that exist, there is not a single moment where he is reaching for the gun, brandishing it, threatening with it, or anything at all, and we have video that shows the entire interaction from start to finish.
Now, it's actually brazen to claim that this was 100% unjustified beyond a shadow of a doubt, because at the time Charlie published this video, there was no completed use of force investigation, no synchronized body cam timeline, no forensic reconstruction, and no verified evidence of a weapon misfire. Declaring absolute certainty before those facts exist is epistemically irresponsible regardless of political alignment. What's happening here isn't analysis, folks. We have to make this clear. It's a cultural reflex that treats early, emotionally charged footage as final truth and rewards influencers for locking audiences into moral certainty before institutions designed to actually establish facts have done their work. And that takes time, folks. And yet, Charlie repeatedly presents conclusions as facts rather than interpretations, leaving no room for nuance or revision, which is precisely how online discourse hardens into camps. Once certainty is declared, any subsequent evidence becomes a threat to identity rather than an update to understanding. This pattern, seen repeatedly in these high-profile cases where early narratives outpace investigations, such as the George Floyd death, encourages audiences to entrench, not learn. And it reflects a broader media ecosystem that prioritizes speed, virality, and moral signaling over actual due process and evidentiary standards. And needless to say, the result is a public that confuses confidence with accuracy, substitutes certainty for scrutiny, and is pushed toward doubling down when facts complicate the story. An outcome that weakens trust in our institutions, it degrades media literacy, and turns complex events such as this one into ideological tests rather than the opportunity for clarity. Now, additionally, and perhaps most shockingly, Charlie builds a straw man and repeatedly calls this shooting an execution, which creates a false dichotomy that frames the event as officers murdering a man simply because he had a gun. That's not what the available evidence actually supports. What's evident is that Alex Pretti chose to insert himself into an active federal law enforcement operation, physically interfered, and resisted detention while armed. Yes, Alex had a Second Amendment right to carry a firearm, but that right does not insulate someone from consequences when they knowingly obstruct federal agents and engage in a physical struggle with them. People intuitively understand this risk every single day. It's why encounters sometimes end in what's colloquially called death by cop, where escalation, resistance, and perceived threat converge into that person's death. I'm not claiming that's what Pretti intended here, but it is a factor that cannot be ignored. Charlie's framing erases the officer's decision-making under perceived threat, the proximity and chaos of the struggle, the commands issued, the compliance and non-compliance unfolding in real time, and the central question of whether officers reasonably believed Pretti could regain control of the weapon. 6 officers don't pile onto someone unless resistance is occurring. Why is everybody who has an opinion on this refusing to acknowledge the fact that there were 6 officers trying to detain Alex, and he was still fighting them after interfering with federal law enforcement agents attempting to detain someone? Now, all that being said, Charlie attempts to make a case that Alex wasn't brandishing the gun. Well, use of force law does not require brandishing. It hinges on reasonable perception of imminent danger, not philosophical arguments about gun rights. The Second Amendment does not override officer safety standards during a physical struggle, such as the Alex Pretti situation, and pretending otherwise reflects a broader cultural problem. A media ecosystem heavily shaped by the left's narrative incentives that collapses complex legal realities into moral slogans, substituting certainty for scrutiny and training audiences to treat constitutional language as a talisman rather than a legal framework. If you're going to invoke the law, you have to understand it. Reducing this to a Second Amendment talking point isn't just misleading. It actively obscures how these encounters actually unfold on the streets today. Now, on top of all of that, Charlie also overstates how much evidence is actually available, and in doing so, creates a misleading sense of completeness. He says that we have video showing the entire interaction from start to finish, but we live in a time where we already understand that video by itself is not a full representation of the truth. A wide shot filmed from 50 yards away is never going to capture everything that matters in a fast-moving, chaotic encounter. There are closer angles that could reveal details we simply can't see from a distance. There is body cam footage that has not yet been released. And there are moment-to-moment dynamics, seconds, even microseconds, that may not be visible because of camera angle, obstruction, lighting, or image quality. That's precisely why every time a new angle has emerged of this shooting, new information comes with it. So even if the footage appears to show the full sequence of events, it does not provide a complete account of what actually happened in that moment. Framing it that way sets up a false sense of omniscience, where seeing the whole video is treated as the same thing as knowing the whole truth. And those two things are obviously not the same.
For him to lose his life being shot multiple times by these agents, all because of him exercising his Second Amendment rights, which again, he wasn't trying to use as an intimidation tactic on the officers or anything like that. When they were beating him on the ground, pistol whipping him on the ground, they happened to see that he had a gun, apparently. He wasn't throwing it at them as like a threat or something, or brandishing it or anything. He simply had it on him, which he was well within his right to do, and he got murdered for it. This is completely unacceptable, and the fucking drones that are somehow like parading around like this is some kind of victory or something is sickening. It should be viewed as treasonous by any real Americans when you see this footage. And they had the gall to say that Alex Pretti was like the instigator, labeling him a domestic terrorist I saw from a couple of places, claiming that he approached these agents with a 9mm. He approached them with a gun looking to start shit. But that is not true. In all of the videos you see, he has a phone in his hands. Not a gun in his hands, he has a phone in his hands. No sane person would ever mistake a phone for a gun. This is blatantly obvious what they're trying to do. And it's something they've been doing a lot recently. Trying to tell you that what you're seeing isn't real. Trust their words, not your eyes. That is completely fucking outrageous, and people are willingly doing it. That's the craziest part.
Needless to say, this is where the commentary becomes increasingly inflammatory and analytically sloppy, relying on heavy appeals to emotion while substituting opinion for substantiated fact. When Charlie says Alex Pretti was killed all because of him exercising his Second Amendment rights, that is a clear category error, folks. Gun rights do not confer immunity from use of force during an active physical struggle with law enforcement, okay? And constitutional protections do not override officer safety standards, as I mentioned before, especially when resistance and perceived threats are present. That sort of framing from Charlie collapses a very complex legal reality into just a moral slogan, which may feel righteous, but is legally incoherent. And by the way, it doesn't just stop there, because Charlie then layers in serious, unsubstantiated claims, asserting that officers were pistol whipping Pretti without any sort of forensic confirmation or clear visual proof. Now, yes, the footage does show a chaotic struggle on the ground, and it does appear at points that officers may be striking him, but the leap from that to definitive claims of pistol whipping presented as settled fact is not supported by the available evidence, especially when the footage is distant, obstructed, and largely fragmented. Now, what I also find interesting is in the middle of all these appeals to emotion, he also does an argument from incredulity. He says, no sane person would ever mistake a phone for a gun, which is just clearly demonstrably false. There are hundreds of documented cases where officers misidentified objects under stress, and law enforcement training explicitly warns about object-weapon confusion in high adrenaline encounters. Dismissing that very real reality isn't just wrong, it's recklessly dismissive of how human perception actually functions under this sort of duress. Now, what stands out to me is that Charlie is clearly replacing legal standards with emotional certainty because there is an ideological and financial incentive to do so. There's a real reward in jumping in early, declaring a strong opinion, and presenting it as settled fact even when the information is incomplete and the investigation is unfinished. In his rush to signal moral clarity, he prioritizes outrage over precision while literally labeling the situation outrageous. And that does a disservice in an already hyper-divisive media environment. He frames the story in a way that reinforces what his audience expects to hear rather than slowing down to review the facts and interrogate the evidence. And the result isn't just a bad take. It's the normalization of shallow commentary where confidence replaces any need for accuracy, and constitutional language is weaponized as a rhetorical shield to appear morally certain in the moment. And in doing so, Charlie is training his audience to feel informed while insulating them from the actual nuance around these sorts of situations. By operating this way, Charlie isn't just misframing a single incident, he's actually contributing to a broader erosion of serious public discourse, making it increasingly difficult to have an honest conversation about law enforcement, use of force, and the circumstances surrounding situations like Alex Pretti's death in this country.
I cannot believe we've reached this level of brainwashing. There are so many angles of this, and in every single one of them, you can see he has his phone in his hand, and at no point during this interaction did he ever, pull a gun on them or anything. And in fact, in one of the angles, you can even clearly see that the agents actually took the gun from him prior to him being shot. You can actually see what looks to be one of the agents disarming him, taking the gun out of its holster and running away with the gun prior to him being shot.
You literally hear the gun go off, dude. You literally hear.
And if that wasn't definitive, there is something even more clear.
Well, thank you, Charlie, for literally making my point for me. You see the agent grab the gun. You hear a shot go off before the other agents even draw their weapons out and start firing. How that gets ignored by Charlie and everybody else is beyond me. Which is why it's so crazy that Charlie is presenting everything here as definitive. He's leaning hard into absolutism while completely cherry-picking the facts. He says every angle shows a phone, that in every single video, you can see a phone in his hand, asserting total visual certainty, which ironically makes his blind spots incredibly easy to challenge. One of those blind spots being his apparent inability to process that as the officer walks away with a weapon, the gun appears to go off. And we just heard it. We just saw it. And again, you hear that before any of the other officers draw and fire their own weapons. It's not that difficult to understand how officers, having just realized the man had a gun, could hear what they perceived as a shot and respond with gunfire without seeing the officer already moving away with a weapon. Their vision is clearly obstructed. There are 6 officers on top of Alex Pretti, bodies overlapping, angles blocked. The officer that runs off with a gun the gun's pointed to the camera. How are you going to assume that they're going to see through his body and see that he has a gun? What I'm trying to say, folks, is basically this. It's not because the videos that we're watching are at certain angles that every single officer on the scene sees the same thing you do from a completely different vantage point. Now, obviously, I'm not declaring any of what I'm saying to be definitive. I'm explicitly not taking the leap Charlie takes here. I'm explaining what it looks like based on what we can see now while acknowledging more evidence is coming. That's the difference between rational people and people who just want to stoke the flames. Declaring certainty the way Charlie does creates blind spots by design because there's absolutely no certainty in the situation yet, which is ironic because Charlie leans so much on these absolutisms that he creates internal inconsistencies when he says things like the agent took the gun before the shooting. If that's the case, did the shooter know? When? How? Was the shooter even able to see it happen? Those questions matter. And Charlie skips them while insisting the conclusion is irrefutable. That's a pure appeal to finality, okay? The moment you claim something is irrefutable, any new evidence that contradicts you just completely destroys your credibility. That's why what Charlie's doing here is so reckless. I'm honestly shocked this video was uploaded in this form. It's embarrassing. And while I'm not claiming absolute certainty around the situation myself, I'm almost sure that as more evidence comes out, large portions of Charlie's video are going to age like milk. Now, for the remainder of the video, Charlie continues to lean into calling this an execution, and from there, he starts relying on a slippery slope fallacy. He repeatedly frames the situation as a man being murdered simply because he had a weapon, as if carrying a gun in America is now by default grounds for you being executed in the streets by ICE. He keeps pushing this idea that if you exercise your right to carry, you're suddenly a risk of execution by the state. That's not only dishonest, okay? It's not even what happened in this case. It strips the situation of all context, the obstruction, the physical struggle, the resistance, the perceived threat, and it replaces all of it with a cartoon version of reality. And what makes this especially egregious is how confidently he leans on that framing, knowing it's emotionally powerful even though it's analytically bankrupt. You know why? Because it makes him money. Now, all that being said, the most insane statement in the entire video comes toward the end where Charlie says this.
But that's not all that's happening here. You could also right now march into the White House and arrest everyone in the White House and you would get a ton of rapists and pedophiles. Why isn't that happening? If the goal is getting rapists and pedophiles off of American soil, thrown in the slammer, taking them away from society, why is it only just walking through the fucking streets of Minnesota trying to do it? You would get significantly more rapists and pedophiles if you took ICE and brought them to the White House. An administration is actively covering up a massive child sex trafficking operation and letting tons of evil people get away with this, tons of clients. So if the goal is to get this kind of evil out of this country, why would you not start with what is provably a spot that has so many of them?
Now that is a false equivalence if I've ever seen one. These are two completely separate situations. The Epstein files and immigration enforcement are not the same issue. And to be absolutely clear, I'm not excusing anyone connected to Epstein. I've said this over and over again. If anyone is convicted of crimes tied to Epstein, any pedophile, any rapist, my stance is simple: death penalty. Execution by firing squad so everyone can see it. I don't mess around with pedophiles. I don't mess around with rapists. I believe it is an inexcusable act. Just like Jesus says, if anyone is caught doing evil to one of his children, it would be better for them to have a millstone tied around their neck and be thrown into the ocean than to face his judgment. That is exactly how I feel about rapists and pedophiles, period. Now, all that being said, this comparison is absolutely dishonest. First off, immigration enforcement and holding powerful criminals accountable are not mutually exclusive. We can do both at the same time. We can investigate and prosecute people in government or the White House tied to Epstein while also enforcing immigration law. There's no rule that says we have to pick one or ignore the other. Second, immigration enforcement is something that was objectively not happening under the Biden administration, And we got multiple people, multiple Americans victimized. And even currently, it's not happening to its fullest capacity because of a breakdown in cooperation between federal authorities and state and county governments, particularly between the Republican federal government and the Democrat-run states and counties. That lack of cooperation has consequences. Border laws exist, and part of enforcing them means removing individuals who are here illegally and who have committed crimes or have prior convictions. So what's Charlie's argument exactly? That we should just ignore immigration enforcement until every powerful criminal is dealt with first? That we should just leave people who are here illegally and committing crimes on the streets in the meantime? Are American citizens just supposed to be treated like sacrificial lambs while the government sorts out elite corruption? That's an absurd framing. We are capable of addressing both problems simultaneously, and pretending otherwise is intellectually lazy and deliberately misleading. And when you stack that kind of false equivalence on top of everything else in this video, it becomes clear why Charlie's entire presentation here isn't just flawed, it's an actual full-blown embarrassment. Look, the situation with Alex Pretti is absolutely unfortunate, and it is a clear example of what happens when a country reaches the level of divisiveness we're currently living in. We now operate in two separate silos of truth, where people online are incentivized to rush to conclusions so they can monetize outrage and influence millions of people in the process. In doing so, they mislead audiences into believing that emotionally charged, anecdote-driven narratives are the truth, even when the truth hasn't been fully investigated yet. That dynamic is dangerous because it can lead to serious miscarriages of justice. The court of public opinion is never grounded in reality, which is why there's an old saying that the first version of history is rarely accurate. You don't have all the facts at the beginning, and we clearly do not have all the facts here. So to sit there with no hesitation or humility and declare this case settled beyond scrutiny, as if no further investigation is needed, is not only utterly irresponsible, it is actively corrosive to any system that claims to care about truth, justice, or accountability. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.